If this story were pitched in a Hollywood studio, it would likely be rejected for being too compressed, too improbable, too theatrically extreme for a single lifetime. Yet it belongs to Arnold Schwarzenegger, an immigrant who moved through three radically different worlds: elite bodybuilding, global cinema, and American politics, without ever fully leaving the last one behind. His public image became a shorthand for the American dream, but the reality underneath was more complicated. Discipline bordering on obsession, emotional distance formed in childhood, and a constant drive to outgrow every identity he created. Each success didn't resolve his ambition, it expanded it. The story is not just about achievement but about escalation, where each victory becomes the starting point of the next conquest. Behind the spectacle of fame, power, and muscle was a psychological engine that never idled. And like many myths built in modern times, the most interesting parts are not the triumphs themselves, but the costs they quietly accumulate along the way. A childhood built in ruins and order. Arnold Schwarzenegger was born in 1947 in Thal, near Graz, Austria, into a country still physically and emotionally shattered by World War II. His father, Gustav Schwarzenegger, represented a strict post-war authority figure shaped by discipline, hierarchy, and unresolved trauma from his wartime past. The household was austere, limited heating, no comfort, and a constant emphasis on obedience. Within that environment, childhood was not romantic or playful, it was structured, comparative, and often harsh. Arnold and his brother were pushed into competition, measured against each other rather than nurtured as individuals. Praise was conditional, affection inconsistent, and failure amplified. Yet within this pressure system, something unusual formed in Arnold: detachment. Rather than breaking under criticism, he began mentally separating himself from his environment, viewing it as temporary rather than defining. That psychological distance would later become central to his ability to endure rejection, reinvent himself, and operate in high-pressure industries without visible hesitation. What looked like repression from the outside functioned internally as focus, the blueprint of escape through strength. As a teenager, Schwarzenegger discovered bodybuilding not as a hobby, but as a structured exit strategy from his environment. Influenced by figures like Reg Park, who embodied both physical dominance and cinematic possibility, Arnold began to treat muscle development as a form of self-construction. This was not casual training. It was obsessive repetition guided by a belief that physical transformation could alter destiny itself. He trained in closed gyms, sometimes sneaking in when facilities were shut, pushing his body beyond comfort into deliberate strain. At the same time, he mentally mapped a future that did not yet exist in his surroundings, leaving Austria, entering America, and turning physique into global visibility. The clarity of this vision gave him unusual discipline for a teenager. Every rep, every set, every increase in weight became part of a larger narrative of escape. Even military service, which interrupted his training, became another stage where he tested his defiance of structure by secretly competing and briefly prioritizing ambition over duty. From local competitions to American arrival, Schwarzenegger's early competitive career escalated quickly, culminating in European titles that validated his belief that he was not meant to remain local. A defining moment came when he left his military post briefly to compete in the Junior Mr. Europe contest, an act that reflected both risk-taking and single-minded focus. Winning reinforced a psychological shift. Rules were flexible when they conflicted with long-term vision. Soon after, he moved through Germany and the UK bodybuilding circuits before ultimately traveling to the United States in 1968. America represented not just geography but ideology, a place where reinvention was structurally possible. His early years there were humbling. Competing against more refined American athletes exposed gaps in conditioning and presentation. Yet rather than discouraging him, defeat sharpened his approach. He relocated to Venice Beach, immersing himself in a culture of elite training at Gold's Gym, where bodybuilding became both community and competition. The environment reinforced his evolution from talented outsider to strategic competitor, someone willing to outwork and outthink physical limitations. Venice Beach, mind games, and cultural breakthrough. At Gold's Gym, Schwarzenegger refined both physique and psychological strategy. Training alongside figures such as Franco Columbu, he entered an ecosystem where physical dominance was standard, forcing him to develop mental advantages. He learned that bodybuilding contests were not purely physical, they were psychological theaters. Subtle intimidation, humor, and conversational control became tools as important as muscle definition. This approach reached global audiences through the documentary Pumping Iron, which framed him as both charismatic and strategically dominant. The film revealed his ability to unsettle competitors before stepping on stage, shaping perception as part of performance. During this period, he also secured multiple Mr. Olympia titles, solidifying his reputation as the sport's defining figure. Importantly, he treated fame as capital rather than endpoint. He invested in real estate, business ventures, and long-term financial structures, becoming a millionaire while still primarily known as an athlete. This dual identity, performer and strategist, became a pattern that would define every later stage of his career. Business thinking behind the physique. While his public image centered on muscle, Schwarzenegger was simultaneously building financial independence. He approached income with the same systematic mindset as training. Alongside bodybuilding earnings, he pursued construction work, mail-order fitness programs, and real estate investments. This diversification insulated him from the volatility of athletic careers. Unlike many peers who relied solely on competition winnings or endorsements, he understood early that physical dominance had a limited lifespan, but capital accumulation did not. His business choices reflected a long horizon, purchasing property in growing California markets and reinvesting profits rather than consuming them. This financial discipline gave him rare autonomy among athletes of his era. It also reinforced a psychological belief that systems could be mastered if studied carefully enough. By the time he was still competing professionally, he had already transitioned into investor thinking, viewing each opportunity as part of a larger portfolio of identity and income streams rather than isolated achievements. Hollywood reinvention and the rise of the Terminator, transitioning into acting, required dismantling assumptions about what leading men looked like in 1970s cinema. Early attempts were awkward, including heavily dubbed roles like Hercules in New York. Critics doubted his accent, size, and emotional range. Yet Schwarzenegger reframed these limitations as branding advantages. His breakthrough came with Conan the Barbarian, where physical presence outweighed dialogue. The transformation peaked with The Terminator, where director James Cameron redefined him not as a traditional hero, but as an embodiment of mechanical inevitability. The character's minimal dialogue and rigid movement turned perceived weaknesses into cinematic identity. Lines like, "I'll be back," became cultural anchors. At the same time, rivalry with Sylvester Stallone fueled competitive escalation in the action genre, pushing both actors toward increasingly extreme physical storytelling. Hollywood did not soften Schwarzenegger. Instead, he reshaped Hollywood's expectations of heroism itself. Peak fame, cultural control, and political entry. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Schwarzenegger had become one of the most recognizable figures in global entertainment. Films like Terminator 2, Judgment Day, and comedies like Twins demonstrated range beyond pure action, expanding his audience. He married Maria Shriver, connecting him to American political lineage and further expanding his public identity. However, behind the controlled image, personal contradictions accumulated. His schedule, fame, and persona demanded constant projection of strength, leaving little space for vulnerability. This era marked both peak control and growing fragmentation between public image and private behavior. Eventually, the idea of influence shifted from entertainment to governance. In 2003, during California's recall election crisis, he entered politics almost seamlessly, using media familiarity and celebrity communication style as campaign tools. His victory as governor of California transformed him into the, quote, governator, merging cinematic identity with real political authority. Governorship, performance meets political reality. As governor, Schwarzenegger initially applied performance logic to governance. believing charisma and visibility could solve structural problems. He promoted environmental legislation, infrastructure investment, and bipartisan messaging, attempting to position himself above traditional party conflict. However, political systems resisted cinematic simplification. Economic downturns, budget crises, and union conflicts exposed limits of personality-driven leadership. Negotiations replaced spectacle. Compromise replaced decisive action. While he achieved notable environmental policy progress, fiscal constraints and legislative gridlock reduced momentum over time. His approval ratings fluctuated, reflecting the volatility of governing complex systems compared to scripted narratives. Unlike films, political outcomes could not be edited or resolved within a runtime. By the end of his tenure in 2011, he left office with mixed legacy, innovative in visibility and climate policy, but constrained by economic reality and institutional resistance. The transition from action hero to administrator revealed the fundamental difference between controlling a story and managing a state. The hidden family and public collapse. Behind political and cinematic success, a private rupture developed over years. Schwarzenegger maintained a parallel personal life that eventually resulted in the birth of a son, Joseph Baena, with household staff member Mildred Baena. For over a decade, the situation remained unspoken publicly, sustained by compartmentalization and secrecy. However, the resemblance became increasingly visible, and eventually the truth emerged in 2011, shortly after his governorship ended. The revelation led to the dissolution of his marriage to Maria Shriver and intense media scrutiny. Public perception shifted sharply, reframing him from disciplined icon to flawed individual. The narrative control he had maintained for decades fractured. Unlike career setbacks in bodybuilding or film, this collapse was personal and irreversible in public terms. It marked a moment where image and identity separated completely, forcing confrontation with consequences that could not be reframed through performance or achievement. Illness, mortality, and physical vulnerability. In later years, Schwarzenegger faced medical complications that redefined his relationship with his own body. A serious heart surgery complication in 2018 required emergency intervention, temporarily placing his life at risk. The experience contrasted sharply with his identity as an embodiment of strength. Recovery was slow, painful, and non-performative. Relearning basic movement replaced training intensity. This phase removed the illusion of invincibility that had defined earlier decades. At the same time, he began engaging more openly with vulnerability, discussing failure, aging, and accountability. His relationship with his children and extended family evolved toward repair rather than image maintenance. The shift was not dramatic reinvention, but gradual recalibration, where identity became less about dominance and more about continuity. Physical decline introduced a new constraint, time itself as a limiting factor rather than an exploitable resource. After the spotlight, the long afterlife of a reinvention. In the years after public office, global fame, and the collapse of carefully maintained personal boundaries, Arnold Schwarzenegger entered a phase that no earlier version of his life had prepared him for. Ordinary time. Not retirement in the traditional sense, but a continuation without a single dominant stage. No Mr. Olympia contest to prepare for, no film release to promote, no political campaign to win. The rhythm that once defined his existence, build, conquer, move on, no longer applied in the same way. Instead, life became accumulation without urgency, relationships to repair, health to manage, legacy to reconsider while still alive to experience it. He became more publicly reflective, often discussing mistakes, discipline, and responsibility with a tone that contrasted sharply with the invincible characters he once portrayed. The contrast itself became part of his identity. The same man who once embodied the Terminator, now speaking about vulnerability, aging, and accountability. Even his public image softened into something less mythic and more human, not because the world demanded it, but because time removed the necessity of maintaining the myth at full intensity. In this final stretch of life, the story is no longer about expansion or domination, but about integration, attempting to hold all previous versions of himself in the same mind without letting any single one define the whole. Conclusion: a life beyond the monument. Today, Schwarzenegger's life presents an image far removed from his earlier myth-making, quiet routines, farm animals, and reduced public spectacle. The contrast between global icon and domestic simplicity highlights the arc of a life defined by escalation, collapse, and adaptation. Each phase, bodybuilding, cinema, politics, was not separate but layered, each building on the psychological architecture formed in childhood. His story ultimately resists simple moral framing. It is neither pure triumph nor simple cautionary tale, but a study in sustained ambition and its unintended consequences. What remains is not the statue of perfection once projected to the world, but a more complex figure shaped by success, error, resilience, and time.